Hi friends, I hope everyone is doing well. I'll be using the sketches created in my last video as inspiration for the collages in this video. If you haven't watched my last video, I'll link it in the description area. One of the collages will use this sketch as the basis for the composition, and this sketch as the color palette inspiration. The other collage will use this sketch's composition, but I want to use a more muted color palette instead of a cool tone color palette that's used in this sketch. I'll be using a glue stick and scissors for all the collages. I'll go over the other supplies in each collage section, so let's get started. Here are the papers I pulled for this collage. As usual, I pulled more than I will use because I like to have options. Also, I'll be using Blick's matte acrylic paint in black and Paper Artsy Elephant to paint a pattern ground. I'm using a Princeton 1-inch flat brush to apply the black paint. Using a large flat brush helps to quickly paint a smooth, solid ground. I chose the black and gray paint because I want to have a subtle contrast for the ground. I didn't want the ground to be too strong that it would stand out more than the collage papers that will be glued on top of it. Now that the solid ground is dry, I brought out this handmade dot stencil along with this Richardson 3/4-inch flathead stencil brush. I haven't stenciled using a brush in quite some time. Typically, I use a stencil when monoprinting. Using a stencil in an art journal can be tricky. From my experience, I know that the stencil image will not be perfect, and I'm okay with that. I find it's good to hold the stencil in the area you're applying the paint, then move your hand as you stencil. This helps to stencil the image. As you can see, the dots are not perfectly round, but I do like the look of these dots on the black ground. I typically don't use stencils when I collage, but I thought I'd show you how to use them. If you want to recreate shapes from a sketch, using templates is a good way to do it. Also, you can use templates for placement before cutting the actual paper that will be used in the collage. It's an added step, but it can be useful if you're new to collaging or if you want a specific looking shape or shapes in your collage. One more thing, I would use templates for collages with small amount of elements because it does double the creating time. I don't think it's necessary to cut a template for this shape. I will use the shape next to it as a gauge for the size and the shape. I'm starting by deciding on the paper for the first template. My paper options are these two. This is a page from a 1968 encyclopedia that lists the states in Maryland. This other is a monoprinted old book page. I'm leaning more towards this encyclopedia page because I want to use this yellow paper in the collage. These two papers are too close in color. What I'm going to do instead of this orientation where you can read the text, I'm going to flip it around to be upside down. I prefer this orientation for ephemera with text. This way the text will be considered a pattern. I like to use washi to tape the template to the ephemera. It secures the template, but it's easy to remove without damaging the ephemera. After I cut a section, it's best to tape the washi to that area to keep the template in place. I won't be gluing down the ephemera as I cut it. I'm cutting all the ephemera, then get the placement correct, then gluing it down. For this yellow monoprinted paper, I'm looking for a pattern area that has good detail. As you can see, I didn't take my own advice about moving the washi tape as I cut. It's easy enough to realign the template on the paper, then continue cutting. Next, I'm auditioning a few paper options for the third template. I thought this dark burgundy paper would be too close in value to the ground, so there wouldn't be enough contrast. These three burgundy pattern papers may be too close in value to the yellow paper. This red paper is close in value as well, but it's brighter than the burgundy papers. It will stand out more, so it's a good option for this element. Again, I'm finding a good section to showcase the pattern on this paper. And lastly, I need to audition paper for the upper right area. This gray paper with the same dot pattern as the ground would lead the pattern in a direction that is light and not enough contrast. I feel the same way for this gray painted paper. This burgundy plaid paper reads as mid-tone, which is the same as the red in the yellow paper. I feel this area of the collage needs a dark value paper so it'll tie into the dark ground. I'm finding the section of it where the pattern isn't too light to keep the dark feel. I'm adding a small amount of glue to secure the two papers together. I prefer not to apply glue while it's sitting on the collage area. Some of the glue may get on the collage. This is why I glue cut papers off camera. Also, it allows me to cut out the gluing section of the video that can be boring to watch. With this placement of the elements, I noticed that the cutout on the yellow element does not show as much of the ground as I would like. I decided to cut more of it off before gluing it down. The final element is ready to glue in place. Here's the final collage. The composition is simple, but I think it's successful due to the pattern papers. I'm happy with the way it turned out. Let's move on to the next collage. Here are the paper options for this collage. I decided not to pull yellow paper even though there's yellow in the color palette sketch. The composition is busy, so I didn't want to add to the busyness with too much color. I think there's enough variety in these papers. I wasn't sure what color green to use, dark teal green or dark forest green or bright green, so I needed to make that decision. Also, I brought out burgundy and red papers. I'm not sure what direction I'm going with the color palette. For the paint selection, I brought out Off-White and Nimbus Gray for the ground. I'll be using Nimbus Gray to paint a pattern on top of a solid off-white ground. I'm using the same 1-inch flat brush to paint a solid ground with the off-white. Off-white is close to the color of the paper in the journal, so you may not think it's necessary to paint it. I want the ground to be seen as a collage element, not as an art journal page that has a pattern on it. Speaking of pattern, I'm using the size 4 brush to paint horizontal lines with the Nimbus Gray. I want the lines to have a varying widths, not a perfect straight line. Even though most of this ground pattern will be covered with papers, I prefer to paint the whole page. It's easier for me to work on placement. This composition may change as I start collaging because I'm not using templates this time. First off, I'm undishing the green papers. Since there's a lot of elements in this composition, I only want to use one green pattern paper, so there should be enough of it for all the green elements. Also want it to be dark in value. I ended up with this green paper because I think it's dark enough and there's enough of it for all the green elements. One more thing, it has a faint horizontal pattern that ties in with the ground pattern. I'm cutting all 3 of the dark green elements, but I won't be gluing at this point. Some of the other color elements will be placed next to these green ones. It's easier for me to cut those shapes in the right size if the green elements aren't glued down. As you can see with this light bluish green paper, the element will be next to this green one. By placing the light bluish green paper under the green shape, I can see where I need to cut it to fit in this space. I'm holding off on gluing this element as well. There's a red element that will be placed in this area, and I want to cut that shape first. This red paper seemed a bit too busy. This burgundy seemed a bit too dark. This bright red paper has a subtle pattern, so I thought it'd be a good fit. Also, the bright red references the bright red in the color palette inspiration sketch. Sometimes I like to fold the paper in the general shape that I need instead of cutting it with scissors. This area is a bit awkward to cut with scissors. If I'm unsure of the final element, I like to cut the paper slightly larger so I have room to cut it down to the right size and shape. Now that the light bluish green and the red shapes have been cut to size, it's time to glue both in place. Now you can see why I didn't glue the green element. I'm keeping it in place and gluing the other 2 elements underneath it. Instead of cutting out this green element to fit the light bluish green under it, I decided to cut the light bluish green to fit on top of it. I think the shape is more interesting with the angle cut edge than the straight edge. In hindsight, I wish I hadn't cut the bottom of this element. It would have been better to wait until I cut the element that would be placed above it. I'm holding off on gluing this element in place for now. Adding a clip helps to keep it in place while working on the elements around it. This next paper has an uneven pattern, so I want to get a section that shows enough of it. Continuing to use the same pattern paper, I'm being mindful to vary the size along with the shape of each element. This element needed a bit of a trim, so more of the pattern ground would show through. I'll be gluing an element from this paper on top of this green element. I was unsure of the size of it, so I thought it'd be helpful by cutting the paper the same size as the green element. Then I could cut it down to fit. It really helped to get the correct size and shape to fit on top. At this point, I'm going to add one more light green blue element and two red elements in the remaining open area. I brought out a pencil to mark one area where the red element will be glued. This area will be covered, so I thought it'd be a good area to add the pencil mark. Also, I want to slightly trim down this other edge. It's a minor adjustment, but I thought it was necessary. Now that the area around this green element is finished, it's time to glue it down. And glue down this element as well. The last decision is the placement of this red element. It's a leftover scrap that fits in nicely in this area. I like that it's overlapped on top of the element above it. It helps to tie the two elements together. Now the final element can be glued down. This collage is finished. Thanks for hanging in with me. I know this collage section was long. I enjoyed making this detailed collage. It's balanced and cohesive. Let's have a final review next. Let's start with this collage made with templates. As I mentioned previously, this collage is simple, but it's successful due to the pattern papers and also the pattern ground. There's light, mid-tone, and dark values. Each element is well defined. The collage is balanced and cohesive. I can see using this collage as a starting point for a collage series. This collage is a good representation of both of the inspirational sketches. I slightly altered the composition from the original sketch. It was more of a fine-tuning. I also altered the color palette slightly by not using yellow. If the substrate was larger, maybe I could have included it. Looking at this final collage, I don't see where I could have placed any yellow elements. It's balanced and cohesive as is. I hope you enjoyed watching me create collages from sketches. Let me know if you have any questions. Thank you for taking time out of your day to watch this video. I'll see you in the next one. Take care.